Welcome to Oklahoma Memo. My name is Ryan Welton, the founder and curator of Oklahoma Memo. It's your daily local news recap newsletter that hits your inbox every Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. What I do is I gather up the local news from vetted newsrooms across the state and I put it together in just one place. If I could compare it to anything, it's like what Sports Center is to sports. So sign up at oklahomamemo.com, but you have reached the podcast portion of what we do here and my weekly conversation with national podcaster and journalist Grant Hermes from the Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes podcast. Welcome, Grant.
Always good to be here, Ryan. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. This was an election week. I'm an election nerd. Tuesday night, I told my wife, I said, I don't know what the plans are, if you've got book club, what's going on, but it's election night, so I'm going to be in front of the TV. And it was an exciting night, and you and I have had some discussions previous to this. While it was seemingly exciting for Democrats, I think we would both say tap the brakes just a little bit because each one of these results are very individual to the areas that they're in. However, for the purposes of the Oklahoma Memo audience back in Oklahoma, let's talk about something that really applies to many of them. In fact, more than 680,000 Oklahomans, and that is where we are with SNAP benefits. My understanding is there was a ruling from a federal judge. The federal judge tells the Trump administration that they've got to pay these SNAP benefits in full by today. And my question to you would be, does the judge have an army to make this happen? Is he really, does he have force of law here?
Yeah, he does. But I want to back up and explain some of this a little bit. So last week, this judge in Rhode Island and another judge in Massachusetts gave the White House until Monday to decide whether or not they were going to fund or not fully fund SNAP in some way. The judge in Rhode Island said, fund it however you want. The judge in Massachusetts said, you got to tell me which one it is. And the White House landed on a partial payment for SNAP, a 50%, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $4.5 billion to get it just through the next month. And the rest was going to be on the states. And starters, states do not have the money to do that right now. The wealthiest states in the country have said they don't have the money to pick up this tab, even half of the tab for SNAP benefits. It's just not there. That's how big of a deal SNAP is. And I guess also for people who don't know what SNAP is, it's the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. We would call it food stamps 30 years ago, but it's called SNAP now. So that's what that is. In the intervening week, after the White House said, hey, we're going to halfway fund SNAP, Trump then went out on Truth Social, but then in other places, and said he was actually going to make the states pay 35%, and then was like, never mind, we're not going to fund SNAP until after the government shutdown was over, to try to use this as a bargaining chip to force Democrats to capitulate. This judge this week, yesterday, on Thursday, was like, actually, that's a full disregard of what my order was. And so now, instead of me giving you the opportunity to decide and work with the states on how you want to do this, I'm just going to tell you have to fully fund SNAP. And that's kind of important for a couple reasons. The question you asked about, like, can the judge enforce this? But, like, first of all, is there money there to do that is the big question. The emergency fund for the USDA, the Department of Ag, only has about $6 billion in this contingency fund, money that is set aside as a multi-year budget for this exact kind of a situation because SNAP is an essential service and by law cannot be halted like this. It costs about $9 billion to fund SNAP for a full month, which feels like a lot of money in the scheme of our overall general fund, which is in the trillions. It's not that much money, but it's still like a lot of money to you and me. So if there's only $6 billion, we're missing $3 billion, and this judge can order that the government fund SNAP fully for the next month, and it's just like, you had to figure out where the money comes from then. There's a general fund, there are emergency funds, you can authorize and move things around. The White House has been willing to do that for other agencies and departments for less essential operations, including things like ICE in Chicago. You would see a big paring down of ICE agents in these operations normally during a government shutdown, especially the ones that are happening domestically in places like Chicago right now, in any other year. So then let's get to your question. Can the judge just order this? And will the White House say, you and what army? Likely, they're going to try. But the judge does have the ability to haul people in and hold them in contempt. And if he can't go to the president, because likely, I mean, there are all sorts of rules that you can't actually do that to a sitting president. They're not laws, there are rules, but like he's not going to do that. He could go as high as Brooke Rollins, the Secretary of Agriculture. He could start with lower level DOJ lawyers who are arguing for the government's position right now in front of him in fully defying a court order. And it might not be their fault, but they're an extension of what the White House is doing. And this judge absolutely could hold them in contempt and put them in jail. And that's a whole other ball of wax we're talking about then. But there are options here for this judge to enforce their ruling. And we'll see what happens by today if the White House is going to do this. I don't think they are. I think they're going to try to appeal this, and it's going to go probably as high as they can get it to go in the next week and a half. I mean, the Supreme Court has locked in some pretty big cases right now that they might not have time on their docket for like an emergency case like this, but like this will get appealed. And in the meantime, 600, almost 700,000 Oklahomans are going to be hungry, or they're not going to know how they're going to pay for their next round of groceries, or they're going to have to skimp on those groceries, which means a lot of people will be hungry in a state where that just shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen anywhere.
Or they'll go to food banks now, but see that there's
Yeah.
friction there because you're going to have to go to a food bank, and the state, what Governor Stitt decided to do, instead of activating a rainy day fund or going through whatever process that would be, the state decided that they would give $1 million a week to food banks to help fund them. And yes, they can manage that money. They can get more out of that money than a lot of entities can, but it's also finite because I believe there was only going to be able to fund like 7 weeks. Now, the reason behind President Trump's decision to appeal this, wouldn't you say it was also political because this is his leverage against the Democrats?
Right. It's entirely political here because the actual reason that like the judge is ordering this is not about the money itself here. It's not about how much money is there, how much money isn't there, how this money is getting spent. It's that the executive branch, the White House, Donald Trump, has to spend this money on SNAP because it is mandated by Congress, by law. And in the Constitution, the president has to carry out the spending of Congress. There are certain things that call impoundments or whatever, and we don't have to get into that now. That's kind of complicated constitutional law stuff here, which the White House would love to engage in. They have not really yet. But in its most basic form, Congress outranks the president, technically, in the Constitution. It's first. It's Article 1. And it means that what Congress says is law and the president is just kind of the manager. He's the executive, the CEO, if you want to think of it like a business, and is carrying out the decisions of the board, Congress. So in Trump doing this, he is actively eschewing that responsibility he has in the Constitution for a purely political moment, trying to more or less extort the Democrats into ending a shutdown by giving in on their big ask right now, which is extending healthcare subsidies. Those have passed. Those passed on Saturday, this past weekend. So those subsidies ran out. And that means like we are going to see a giant fluctuation in all of our healthcare prices. People who are on Obamacare and Medicaid, Medicare subsidies are going to see massive fluctuations in what they're paying, double, triple. We've talked about this before. But it really is the president using this as a way to try to get some kind of political leverage against the Democrats. And like, it's gross. Like, we're talking about hungry people, hungry kids, people who are, most of them, the broad majority of them are working poor. They are taking care of somebody at home where they have a health condition that doesn't let them work. The vast majority, we're talking upper 80s into the 90% of people on SNAP who are fit into that category. So these aren't people who are sitting at home trying to cash a check to buy lobsters and steak. That's just not the vast majority of people who use this thing. And in the meantime, everybody else is going to go hungry because the president wants to use this as a way to get Democrats to do what he wants. It, it's it is also not a thing I want to say too in the polls. Americans know this. Uh, they are really sensing that the president is using this stuff this way. Uh, I haven't seen the latest polls about what the White House is deciding to do about air travel, because that's also happening. We can talk about that too in a second if you want. But I want to wrap up on Snap before we do. It's just American people know that this is how this White House is going to operate, and they don't care for it. More Americans still blame Republicans and Donald Trump for this shutdown than Democrats. We saw the results of some of that in the elections this past week and in the way that people are feeling. And we'll see how long the president can decide to do this, or more aptly, how long the Senate and members of the House are willing to let him play this game, because he is a lame duck president. Third term nonsense aside, he cannot be president again, so he doesn't actually have any political constraints. Everybody in the Senate and the House, they got to run for office again. Whether it's, this year in the Senate or 4 years from now in the Senate, they got to run. And this will be an albatross around their necks that's going to bring them down, especially if you're somebody in the House who's got to run in the next year, for sure.
I have my favorite caller, Grant, spam risk.
Ooh.
Let me turn off my phone there. Just a little flavor for those of you listening at home. That was the president. Just to expand upon that, we heard from Mark Wayne Mullen, Senator Mark Wayne Mullen. He had an interview both with Alex Cameron at Griffin Media and Caitlin Collins, and they both the guts of the interviews were basically the same. Mullen said that he had talked to people in the Senate and that the Democrats' plan all along was to wait for the elections to be done, and then they decided they would come back, and it was all sort of planned, and then that didn't happen. Why is there any reason? I've had lots of discussions with people about this. The Democrats are doing this for a righteous reason. In my opinion, they want to make sure that healthcare is both accessible and affordable. Do they have any reason to capitulate at this point?
No, and it's certainly not after the elections this week. And while yes, and we're going to talk about that in a second too, but yes, some of those things are localized, they are individual to those states and to those cities, but everybody was sort of waiting to see how this little mini midterm amuse-bouche sort of, I think I called it an appetizer sampler of what might get in the midterms. Everybody was kind of waiting to see where people were going to fall in these states and then recalibrate from there. And Democrats feel very strong. They're on firm footing, to feel that way after this election or these sets of elections. And Republicans had that, plus they had to wait for Trump's reaction. And he's been sort of non-committal, weirdly, these were trouncings in these elections. And so if he can't turn a loss into a win, he's just going to kind of ghost through it like it didn't happen. And so I think that gets them to the Republicans, it gets them to a certain place in which they realize that they might kind of be on their own when it comes to ending the shutdown. On top of that, the president has continued to call for an end to the filibuster, which both Speaker of the House Mike Johnson and John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader for Republicans, just do not want to do. They both publicly said that this week. Thune has said it multiple times. They want to keep this 60-vote threshold to not end the filibuster, basically, is how this works in the Senate. And I can go into a quick civics thing about the filibuster if you want me to, but they don't want to end that because they want to keep it as a tool to force debate, which is the idea behind it in general. And there's a vote today in the Senate that's going to happen later this afternoon as we're talking here at about 10 a.m. my time, 9 a.m. Oklahoma time. We'll see what happens with that. There could be real inroads to that. Earlier this,
they are statesmen. They understand the role of the Senate versus the House. And you mentioned President Trump being a lame duck president. Yes, technically. And there's not going to be a third term. Mike Johnson, the Constitution says it's not going to happen. But he's really a lame duck right now that the 2026 midterm campaigns are going to be underway, because a lot of these folks are going to be fighting for their political lives.
They really are. And I think getting out of this shutdown now before, if they can, before the holiday travel season starts and before holiday shopping starts, the economy still isn't, I think, where the president pretends it is. By no means. It's as good as he thinks it is. But if they can get out of this shutdown, a lot of people will feel a little bit better about Republican governance, at least in the short term over the holidays, which is what these Republicans want, especially the ones who are running for office in 2026. Uh, we'll see if they get that through. I mean, I'm sure there's a way that the president will turn that into a win for himself. Maybe in the guise, I mean, like if I, were to put on some sort of like political hat or whatever, it's sort of like one of these things where it's like you as Republicans say you're going to negotiate healthcare with the Democrats, whether or not that's true, whether or not the Democrats take their word for it, who knows? But you say you're going to negotiate with Democrats, you get out of this thing, they give you what you want, SNAP gets funded, the FAA air travel goes back in place, everybody goes back to work, workers get back pay, although the White House is playing with the idea that they won't. And you get to say, as a Republican president, this is because of my leadership. I stepped up, brought people to the table, and did this thing. Even though, like, we all know that after more than a month, likely at this point it'll be closer to 45 days, you know, that's not the case. They were actively working against that thing. But there's a path out of this politically for Republicans if they can figure out a way to do it. The struggle for someone like John Thune and Republicans in the Senate is, can they thread the eye of this needle, which is not pissing off Trump, but also making sure that their members in both the Senate and the House are safe. And that's a pretty narrow lane at this point, especially given what we saw this week in these elections across the country.
Yes, elections across the country, and a lot of these folks are going to be fighting for their political lives in the next year,
Mm-hmm.
and Democrats were excited by some of the victories. I mean, New York is its own entity, and Mamdani
Yeah.
has really no relation on the rest of the country. But the Virginia vote, especially, was absolutely an answer to the furloughs that were happening. There are like 134,000 federal workers in
Yes.
Virginia, and you have Abigail Spanberger, former House of Representative, a former congressperson, wins by like 15, 16 points over
Mm-hmm.
Winsome Earl Sears. Great name, by the way. But
Great name.
she should have been
Very Virginia name.
very Virginia.
Yeah.
But Winsome, I had to look up what Winsome means. Charming.
Yeah,
It's
charming.
charming. So, but she didn't exactly get the help of the president. What was happening
No.
there?
Well, so I don't totally know, because the president stuck his neck out and, put his name into all of these other races across the country, but didn't do the closest one to him across the Potomac. So there are a couple things there. I think one of them is that the president just didn't really care about that race a ton, which I think is weird. But like, he could have just not cared as much because it's kind of outside of his own personal worldview, even though, the Pentagon and the CIA are both in Virginia, not to mention like Quantico for the FBI and like a whole host of other U.S. agencies. But like, the entire Department of Defense is in Virginia. Like, and the president's relationship, not just this one, but any president's relationship with the governor of Virginia, is a really important one because of how many federal workers live in Virginia and work in Virginia. It's worth pointing out that Winsome Earl Sears is a Black woman and a Jamaican immigrant. And I pointed this out in my episode this week. Like, I can't say that the president, for sure didn't back Earl Sears because of those things. But if you look at the track record of who the president targets when he insults people, it's generally women of color. Generally, it's Black women. When he's been targeting American cities across the country with threats of sending troops in or actually sending troops in, it has generally been first cities that have been run by Black women as mayors. And then kind of his entire immigration apparatus right now is about reducing the number of immigrants of color in the United States, legal or illegal. I mean, you could talk about all of the Caribbean immigrants that moved to places like Ohio or Kentucky or Tennessee. This administration has a real problem with, and like Earl Sears is a Caribbean immigrant. So, like I said, I can't say that the president didn't endorse her for racist reasons, right? But it would be probably a pretty easy, anti-Trump ad that would go out to say he did back this person, but then, you know, is doing all these other things. So, like, which side is Trump on? And like, he gets attacked from the right somehow. That's wild to think. But like, you know, maybe it's a political thing. Maybe it's a Stephen Miller thing of saying like, hey, we can't do this. I don't know. It was really bizarre.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
really bizarre, and I think about, something that, an analysis that President Trump himself gave of the elections the other night. He says, "I think the biggest issue was I wasn't on the ballot." Well, I think maybe America is seeing the future of elections because he ain't gonna be on the ballot after this.
right, right. To his credit, he's right. He said that on Truth Social. He's right about the idea that he wasn't on the ballot, and then the government shutdown was bringing people down, for sure. Because the government shutdown for a lot of people is just tied to the economy, and people don't feel great about the economy right now because it's not as good as he promised it was going to be. Um, but like, yeah, the interesting thing about Trump not being on the ballot, even when he's endorsed somebody, he's not on the ballot. It's that Republican voters, when they go to vote for Donald Trump, they're voting for Donald Trump. They're not voting for necessarily the party apparatus that he represents. They might say that in exit polls, but if that was the case, they would be just as adamant. Even the most ardent Republicans and Trump supporters and MAGA people would have voted in these elections a lot more if it was the mission and the platform of the Republican Party that they were really enthused by, and it's just not. It is Donald Trump. He is the ideology of the party right now, and that means that in a future where there is no longer a Donald Trump at the top of this party, whether it's because he is out of office and they decide to move into a more J.D. Vance direction, or if like we kind of keep saying, like if time remains undefeated and like Donald Trump is no longer with us, uh, then like what's holding this loose coalition of people together? Because that kind of is what MAGA is. You've got all these things sort of cobbled on and like stuck on to Donald Trump the man because people like him. And that's pretty evident here. And if like I was in the Republican circles, I would be wondering about how do we start to like shore up a little bit here for a post-Trump Republican Party. Does he become a Reagan-esque figure? Maybe, but like that broke down pretty quickly after Ronald Reagan left office. Uh, and while a lot of Republicans hung on to that and still kind of cling to that in certain places, it's not the majority of them anymore. But like that waned over time. And so how do they keep pressing forward with this thing? I don't know. But it's pretty clear that that's a conversation they're going to have to start having, and it's not one the president's going to want to be around for or want, people to talk about around him, but it's one that they're going to have to start having for sure.
I don't want to be too cynical about it, but as I was watching the analysis, it seemed to me, and of course I've paid attention to these things, believe it or not, Grant, since I was like 6. So it just,
Me too.
I was 42 when I was 6. It feels like that folks are only getting out to vote when the pain is high. And
Yeah.
it's almost like that the strategy for the Democrats would be for any party would be to make sure that things are just awful, and that they can blame the other side for it to get them out to vote. It's still
Yeah.
get out the vote. SNAP benefits,
Yeah.
that's impacting a lot of people, but so is air travel. And this week, we have I don't know, is it 10% reduction in air traffic volume? It's not impacting
Yeah.
Oklahoma City or Tulsa specifically yet, except for the fact that folks from Oklahoma City and Tulsa have to fly to a lot of these places.
Right. If you got to fly from OKC or Tulsa to, let's say, Chicago, or you're going to fly to Love Field down in Dallas, or just DFW in general down there, uh, there is a decent chance at this point that the flight that you were going to connect with won't take off or will be massively delayed. It's 10% reduction at 40 of the largest airports in the country. And that is I mean, it's the busiest airports we have. It's LaGuardia, JFK, Dallas, Atlanta, O'Hare, Midway, LAX. Like it's almost any major one you can think of in almost every state is being impacted by this, and it's it is, I think, being accurately described as a pressure tactic from the White House against Democrats to like say, the Democrats forced us to do this, and it's their fault that this is happening to you, and you can't go see grandma and grandpa for Thanksgiving. The the interesting thing is that members of Congress are saying, hey, like who sit on committees that would get this information are saying, hey, the FAA nor the NTSB brought to us any indication that flying has become so unsafe that we need to do this reduction this time of year, which is going to blow a hole in a lot of these major air travel companies and their subsidiaries that are linked to how air travel works. So the economics of that are bad for a lot of places. But it is interesting that the FAA recently said, hey, we're starting to see signs of air traffic control strain, and air traffic control has not been in a good place for quite some time. That predates the shutdown and predates Donald Trump. But for for those reasons, it really does seem like this was just an arbitrary decision to make this as painful as possible from the administration. And again, Americans aren't stupid. They're going to see this and they're going to know that. I mean, I do want to say that Jennifer Homney, the head of the National Transportation Safety Board, who was first appointed by Trump in 2018 and then re-upped by Biden, so she's worked for both sides here. Although is much more of a Trump loyalist this time around, but I think kind of everybody in the government has to be so they don't lose their jobs. She said this is the right thing to do for safety. So I want to put that out there too. But again, like members of Congress are saying, hey, no one's talked to us about that because they designate money for things like air traffic control. So they have to figure those things out. Yeah, it just is another bargaining chip. And it could be because this shutdown's dragging out for longer than the Republicans thought it was going to. It could be because they think they're going to lose when it comes to SNAP, and healthcare is important to people, and so they're losing on that issue too. And people generally trust Democrats more on healthcare than Republicans. But yeah,
Do you think at some point, because I've seen a couple of articles referring to the congressional GOP finally getting over MAGA and deciding to take their rightful place as the Article One, the leaders really of the three branches of government. Do you think that this might be the thing that makes that happen?
I don't know. There are a lot of people out there saying that, you know, this is the moment in which, like, a full year into the presidency, people have seen how unpopular Trump's policies are. I mean, on every issue, from crime to inflation to prices to immigration, I the president's handling of those issues, so his policies are underwater by tens. I mean, he's below 30% in some of these cases. So I don't know if it's when we start to see sort of a schism. Um, they're dealing with their own internal fights right now that have nothing to do with whether or not they're going to break with Donald Trump. I think most of them on the ground are still too afraid of their own base voters, their own midterm voters who tend to be the most engaged and the most emotionally enthusiastic to vote because it's an off-year election, which is just say there's not a presidential ticket. I think they're still trying to figure out how to find a way to stake their own claim while also bringing it back to MAGA, because as long as Trump is the head of the party, he is going to remain the thing that people kind of get ensorcelled by, that they're getting drawn into, get back into the thing. Trump will be campaigning during the midterms and those elections, or those campaigns, I should say, and he's good in front of a crowd. It's where he's at his best, and that will reanimate people. And so I don't know if a break is coming. I have no doubt that those conversations are happening about where you can stake your flag. But yeah, I just don't think it's going to be the thing. These elections this time around won't be the thing. It's not for a little while. We might be able to, in hindsight, point back to a couple of these things, but in this moment right now, I don't know.
Go
It's hard to tell.
So much politics and so much real world
Yeah.
impact. I want to make sure that viewers and listeners know what's happening on Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. And not only did I watch your "So what do the elections all mean?" Episode from yesterday,
Yeah.
but also the one where you talked about President Trump's interview on 60 Minutes, his confessional, as you call it. I haven't watched the whole thing, but I find it just rich that he was doing this interview after he sued them and after CBS capitulated just a few years
Mhm.
ago.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. If you haven't gone back to watch it, like, you definitely should. 60 Minutes also put up the full interview that wasn't cut down for airtime because they only have 60 minutes. That's why it's called that.
Right.
And it was like a 27-minute interview, so it was, in terms of, like, with commercials, that's more than half the show. Um, but the full one is about an hour and 15 minutes if you wanna sit that long and watch it. Um, and, like, for starters, the White House did not object to 60 Minutes editing down this interview to 27 minutes, which is what Trump sued 60 Minutes for over a Kamala Harris interview, basically saying that the thing that every newsroom does, that every journalist does during an interview, which is to distill what somebody is saying to make it the most concise version of the point they're trying to make for you, the audience. They said that that was beyond the pale in election interference, and any standard of the First Amendment, CBS and 60 Minutes and Paramount would have won that case in court pretty handily. Like, if they'd gone to court, the judge likely would have just thrown it out. But instead, Paramount was trying to do a merger with the company Skydance for lots of money and decided to settle so that they could get that merger to go through, which is its own version of this thing. But, like, in this interview, you got a lot about Trump talking about the shutdown, Trump talking about prices. He continues to say that the prices are as low as they've ever been, which is just not true. Grocery prices right now are at a 30-year high. The only thing that actually has gone down in price since he's been president is the price of eggs, which I guess was a promise that he made in the election. It's just everything else is getting more expensive. Yes, inflation is down from the 9% that we saw in 2022 under Biden, which was a product of the, like, global economy recovering from the pandemic. But inflation was lower when Trump took office, and it's been creeping back up since about April. So we're above where normal is. We're at 3%. Normally it's at 2%. I know it's kind of tricky and rickety or whatever, but, like, yeah. The really important ones, I think, were the ones about the pardon that he issued to a cryptocurrency CEO who pled guilty to $4 billion of essentially money laundering. And he did it for Hamas, he did it for Al Qaeda, he did it for other terror groups, or allowed it to happen on his platform. And that was why he was convicted. And Trump pardons this guy and then tells Dora O'Donnell, the interviewer for 60 Minutes and the former anchor of CBS Evening News, that he didn't know who this guy was. And basically, it made it sound like his kids, his sons, who run the Trump family crypto business, wanted this guy to get a pardon because this guy helped them get $2 billion in crypto into their family fund, which Trump is not divested from. So it, like, that admission in itself would be a massive presidency-ending scandal for any other president in American history. Like, it was wild. It's wild.
So it was
And
kind
then
of
I
like
think
a
the other big one,
confessional.
I mean, it really was. And then, like, the stuff about what he's seeing on the ground in Chicago from ICE agents, where you've got, ICE agents ramming cars of U.S. citizens because they didn't like the way they were holding their steering wheel or whatever, which is Bovin, the guy who is running ICE in Chicago right now, has made that distinction about why he can pull someone over. To smashing windows, to dragging kids out of apartment complexes who are barely clothed or not clothed at all and zip tying them. And Trump was asked if that's going too far. And he said, I don't think it's going far enough. And that was an interesting little confessional, too, about I don't know what the president thinks he wants done, but it's more than that. And that is what's been happening in Chicago. Whether you agree or disagree with the president's ideas of immigration, most people are saying that they don't like how that's being handled. Most people like the idea of removing undocumented immigrants from the country, but they don't like this version of that. And so that was interesting. And then he continues to say that he's got the ability to send troops wherever he wants under the Insurrection Act, and kind of asked the American people to thank him for not sending Marines into your neighborhood, which was weird. And so it's a confessional in the idea that, like, he could literally confesses to pardoning this guy that he has no idea about. But also that we get a peek behind the curtain about how the president is thinking about these things, how he's being advised about these things. And like it still matters that these interviews exist. It still matters that something like 60 Minutes still exists, because you get space and time for people like Donald Trump to expound a little bit on their ideas beyond the pretty canned Oval Office, speeches and ceremonies and those things. So it was a really, really interesting interview. And like, I don't know, if you're bored this weekend, listen to the episode from Tuesday on Make It Make Sense, and then go listen to the 60 Minutes interview, because like it's good.
Those are must listens for me every week. Make it make sense with Grant Hermes for sure. I will tell you, I think that eventually, I mean, and I thought this in 2020, that people are going to be sick and tired of chaos, and just it is an energy drain. It doesn't it really, I mean, I get how Reagan invigorated some folks on the right, but even folks on the right have to buy food and have to travel. But the question is always in political campaigns, will it get people out to vote? And that's what 2026 is going to be all about.
And chaos was animating in 2020. I mean, the reason that Biden really won that election in 2020 was because he was uh, not chaotic. It was that whole campaign was about a return to normalcy, and like, yes, we were coming, through a pandemic at that point in time, and so normalcy was out the window for everybody. But like, it was about we had been through 4 years of so much chaos, of a daily deluge of a new, sort of four-alarm fire, and we've gotten that on steroids in the last year, not even year, 9 months, right? 11 months or whatever of this from this administration. And a lot of people in this moment are wondering if they can continue at this speed, at this pace, just in their own daily lives, even if they are not like fully engaged political people like you and I are. If you're the average person, this stuff is still exhausting. Prices are still more expensive when you go to get groceries. Your energy bill is still more expensive in most states. Government offices are less efficient because of this government shutdown, and will continue to be after the shutdown ends, whenever that happens, because there has to be a ramp back up. It's exhausting to so many people for so many reasons, and chaos is animating. And when people are unhappy, they turn out to vote because they're unhappy.
It's going
And I think it's going to be the thing for 2026.
You bet.
For sure.
And it's going to be an interesting year ahead. I'll tell you what's not exhausting. That's talking to you each week, Grant Hermes. Grant from Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. Do you have anything big coming up in the next week? I want to make sure that people are also subscribing to your newsletter.
Yeah, I've got a really great interview that's dropping this afternoon. So it actually might be up at the time this gets up. It just depends on when I can put it up. About the fashion of politics right now, literally what people are wearing and how we're sending different messages to each other through that. And that specifically in the MAGA world, there's a really interesting kind of like three-tiered system of who's who and what they're wearing. And it just doesn't quite exist on the left, which also says something about how disorganized Democrats are right now. But it's a fascinating conversation. I was thrilled to be able to get Lindsay on the show to talk about this. She's writing a book about this. It's great. I do, hopefully, in the next 2 weeks, so maybe not next week, but the week after, just in time for Thanksgiving, I'm going to have Amanda Littman on the show from Run for Something, who had a hand directly in helping Zohra Mamdani run for the mayor's office in New York City. And she does a whole bunch of work with younger people running for politics. And it's a fascinating look at what the changes might be coming up for Congress. And then I'm going to have a new newsletter coming out that'll be free for people to subscribe on the Substack, where we take a deep dive into like civics class, basically. the basics that we all kind of forgot. So that's all on the docket, but you can subscribe for free at the Substack. Just search Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. If you want to pay for it, it's $5 a month. I don't want to like log roll and chill on your show here, Ryan.
Please
But
do.
it helps me keep going, man.
I mean,
It helps support the show, helps this thing work.
that's how the creator economy works, and you provide so much value to the folks who
Thanks.
either are loyalists to Oklahoma Memo or just stumble upon this video, and I appreciate it greatly. Grant Hermes from Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. And folks, if you listened all the way through, why not take 5 extra minutes and leave us a 5-star review? If you listen to it on a podcast on YouTube, leave a comment, ask a question. It would be great to have a questions episode sometime, but you got to leave the question first. So
I would love that.
I think that would be awesome. So for me, I'm Ryan with Oklahoma Memo. Sign up for the daily newsletter at oklahomamemo.com. And Grant Hermes of Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. We will talk to you next week.